to begin.
You're listening to Magrito Podcast Network, celebrating the culture of Chicanos and Latinos one story and voice at a time. Listen to more Magrito Podcast Network shows over at magrito.net.
Hey, what is up, guys, and welcome back to another episode of the Social Primate Podcast. We have the return, although you may not know it, it's a return of Stephanie Mendez on the podcast.
What's up, everyone? Big Bad Santana in the house.
Dude, last time you came in, we had this whole badass conversation, and we lost it. So this is the replay of that.
Hey, you know what? It doesn't get more punk than that, right? So whatever.
And talking about that, I mean, I've already gotten a chance to kind of get to know you a little bit, but what I had mentioned to you previously is that when I came across your work, through LA Taco, there were some articles on the punk scene that you were writing, and then little did I know that these articles were written by you. And until when I started doing my research to kind of get information about who you are, I was like, wait a second, this is deja vu. I've already read this stuff.
That's so funny. And I'm known locally as the punk journalist, but I just happen to be a journalist who is punk rock, right? So I feel like me documenting the scene and writing all of these articles, I mean, that was just part of my innate punk upbringing. And then later becoming a journalist was just something that happened entirely independent of that. And then eventually, right, as I got through my career, in my late 20s, I kind of returned to writing about punk. And so it's just all kind of coalesced now at this point.
Yeah. Now, at this point, how long have you been doing journalistic work?
Journalistic work. Well, it depends on if the stuff that I was doing when I was 18 years old, if that counts as journalism, right? Because I was documenting the punk scene in the greater Los Angeles area for this now defunct website called Big Wheel Magazine, right? And so that entailed doing interviews, writing articles, writing album reviews. So if that counts as journalism, great. It started when I was 18 years old. But if we're talking about a more traditional kind of orthodox journey, then I'd say that probably started happening when I was a student in community college. So maybe 1920 is when I started writing for my campus paper at Orange Coast College. And, eventually I added journalism as a minor. So professionally, it just kind of went from there. Now,
what led you to start representing the culture that you were in? You go to shows, you're part of it, but you don't start really becoming aware of where you are in this culture until much later,
I think for me, it really started happening at the same time that I was writing for Big Wheel Magazine, because with Big Wheel, I was mostly doing big venue shows at the Fonda, the Knitting Factory, the Key Club, right? And that's because the bigger punk bands were playing there, right? The Addicts and Adolescents, etc. But because I grew up going to backyard gigs, I think I reached a point where I just thought, well, what if I write about this? What if I, include this? And I pitched it at the time to the editor. I said, hey, I'm going to this backyard gig. If I take some pictures, you think I could do an article on it? Yeah, sure. That sounds fun. And then, it just became literally inherent to my work at Big Wheel Magazine is sometimes there'd be a backyard gig, or sometimes there'd be a ska core gig in a parking lot, and I would just write about it, because again, these are things that I was actually doing and going to as a teenager, and especially also in my early 20s. So yeah,
and I mean the big part of that is just the whole archiving process of it, right? Because like I mentioned, I was maybe 15, 14 when I got introduced into the punk scene. And then to me, again, it was just a form of expression, right? And ultimately, I realized that, we're producing this culture. And if nobody's going to write about it, who is? And otherwise, it just gets kind of lost.
Exactly. And I think we saw a lot of that backlash, right, with the Vans Punk documentary, Los Punks, which I was actually featured in, because we had someone who, although the director was very active in the alternative and metal scenes in New York. In fact, she's friends with all the OG New York hardcore heads, right? And so even though she was part of the music overall scene for when she came out here to LA and started documenting, I mean, there was such a backlash from the community because it felt to them like it was someone capitalizing, right, on something that was so normal to us, something that was so, I mean, thinking of like a ratchet backyard gig where we're all paying like $2 to get in, and we're drinking our King Cobras. Like, that doesn't seem like anything special, right? Or extraordinary. And yet the director did see this, witness this, and right, they don't have backyard gigs in New York. They don't have backyard gigs. It's not something that they do on the East Coast, really. I'm sure you might have a one-off, but not in the way that we do it out here. Especially like, you know, back in the day, like you'd have like 4 different backyard gigs per night to choose from, right? And they were spread all over LA. And so like when you think about like what we were sort of spoiled with growing up like that, and you realize, wow, it's not like this in the rest of the country. You know, maybe it was sort of like myopic for us, so we didn't see like what was so special about it. But we had someone right from New York who came out and was like, whoa, I want to document this. And for better or worse, right, like I appreciate like the initiative so much, but I think it also opened up our eyes and made us realize collectively as a community, like, who should be telling our stories, and maybe it should be us.
Yeah, exactly. You know, and I think some of the stuff that I read while, you know, some of the articles that you've put out, again, kind of encompasses that emotion, that experience, and you read it, you can't help but like think back, like, damn, I was there, you know?
It's so crazy, right? Thinking of it as like this kind of historical archive, like the historical record, right? And you look back at all these gigs, and you look back at these venues that aren't even around anymore, like the Allen, right? Or even Knitting Factory, Key Club especially. That was like one of my favorite venues. You look at all of this and you see past articles or past like, you know, photos on Facebook or whatever, and you realize, wow, I was at that show, or I was part of that. And I guess it's always in retrospect that you realize like how special or how unique, or in some cases how historical like an experience is, right? You don't realize it until like you're looking back. But yeah, it's so interesting now, like being in my early 30s, I can still say that for the next month. But it's so interesting being in my early 30s and looking back and seeing, wow, I guess these situations, these experiences, like recently I was like going through my old work at Big Wheel magazine, and I came across this show that happened, I think it was 2009 or 2010. Anyways, so the show was at Key Club, and that night Youth Brigade was playing, I think TSOL was playing, and there ended up being a huge riot. Like the cops shut Sunset Boulevard down, and I remember like they were spraying us with like pepper spray, and they were shooting people with bean bags, and like it was on the news and everything. And I was looking back and I'm like, oh wow, I was there. Like, and it was fun. I mean, we were, my friends and I were drunk, and we were like, you know, it was like chaotic, and you know, punks of course love that kind of crap. So we were having a blast. But I look back at that and I'm like, oh wow, like now this, who knows, like in the next punk anthology, right? Like they might mention this show, right, as being something more of a contemporary, you know, instance that you can compare and contrast with like the old riots of Hollywood in the 80s, right? Especially after Golden Voice shows. So yeah, it is really fascinating to look at these moments of like of fun and chaos, and then realizing, oh my gosh, this is like totally like history in the making.
Yeah, you know, and especially in the communities like, you know, East LA or Southeast Los Angeles, like all you can really do is just have these shows at backyards, right? So like, you know, everybody's, you know, tight knit already, like in those communities that we're living in. Like, of course you're going to hear about the shows that are going on, and of course you're going to show up because those are accessible to you.
Exactly. And actually I talk about this in the article that I wrote for Spin about like East LA and the history of like the punk gigs there. And just like you said, right, like because backyards are accessible, like to homeowners, to you know, people in the community, it's sort of like a last resort in a way, right? Yeah. And so the way that started happening in the early 80s, it was out of necessity, right? Because punk bands weren't allowed to play, you know, the Hollywood clubs in Hollywood. And you know, I think the cool thing about DIY is that like you will find a means to like create and cultivate like whatever you want, especially in the punk scene. So it came out of necessity, and it wasn't specifically punk that gave birth to the backyard gig movement. Actually in the late 70s, they were having these like stoner like rock parties where people, in the East LA area, Boyle Heights, they were having, they'd invite their friends as bands to come play in the backyard. But it wasn't to the extent that we do it now, where it's like packed ass, backyards and everyone chugging, and it wasn't anywhere near that. They would call them like kickbacks, like, oh, we're having a kickback, and it would be a couple of bands playing, right? But it really kind of evolved out of that. And because like back then, especially, like, even if you weren't punk necessarily, but you were like a rocker and you happened to have punk friends and you happened to have alternative friends, back then all of those scenes were really intermingled. Like they were really like, there wasn't the division or the separation of genre the way that there is now. So stoner parties, these stoner backyard gigs, were eventually like meshing with like the punks and the punks throwing gigs. So it just kind of like happened very organically.
Yeah, no, and that just brought upon like a whole new flavor of music as well. Like it started changing just the scene for future generations.
Exactly, because backyard gigs aren't even exclusive to punk anymore, right? Like everybody has them. Metalheads, psychobillies, like anybody that's part of like all of these subgenres, right? Like in these like countercultural like communities. I mean, again, backyard gigs, they've transcended punk rock in that like every scene has them, every scene will throw them. And yet, like, we can definitely credit East LA specifically and punk rock for helping to make that such a like mainstay in Southern California and beyond.
Yeah, it's funny because the other day I was walking, I live in Cudahy, and I started hearing like this metal band just going hardcore, and I was like, what the hell? And there's like, I passed this house and there's like a Maya just kind of protecting everything, and there's like a underground, local metal show happening. And I was like, dude, hell yeah, Because, everywhere, I mean, again, I'm in Southeast LA. Every weekend there's mariachis, there's banda, norteños, like parties. So, of course you're going to have the space for shows, and people are craving that too.
Exactly. And to that point, which is something else that I mentioned in my Spin article, right? It's like, it's such a Latino cultural like thing to throw a party at your house or in your yard for, whether it's a quinceañera or a boda or, a baptism, whatever, right? Like, again, this goes back to accessibility. And what is most accessible to a family, a low-income family who doesn't have the means to rent out a hall or rent out a venue space, right? Well, just do it in your backyard. And I think that this very like Latino cultural phenomenon is yet another kind of factor, right, that kind of helped elevate this backyard gig phenomenon as such a like, as a very like East LA like core thing, you know what I mean? And again, like backyard gigs, even back then, they didn't only happen in East LA, right? You'd find them in South Central, you'd find them in Orange County, you'd find them all over LA. But when it comes to like the history and the reason why it became like such a phenomenon, it was because the East LA punk bands couldn't get gigs in Hollywood.
Yeah, exactly, right. And I think you briefly mentioned too that a lot of the times where they tried or they attempted to do it, they were just shut down because of the color of their skin or just where they're coming from, and it just affected their the resources that they had available, right? Right.
So I spoke to Johnny Alvarado, who used to play in Fishhead and was involved with the punk scene in the 80s. And when I interviewed him, he told me that whenever they would call like the Hollywood clubs to try and get on the roster, try and get in the lineup, they would ask them like, well, where are you from? Where's your band based? And the minute you said East LA, they would hang up on you, or they would, call you by a bunch of different slurs. They'd call it like Beaner Rock, Taco Punks. And so that was like a very real kind of like racial obstacle that the bands back then would face. And so they wanted to play, right? Like, but they couldn't get into the clubs. They couldn't really find success at all with the Hollywood scene. And even players, even bands and band members and community members from the Hollywood scene, would project some of that racism towards them as well. So for them, it just made more sense to stay in East LA, to throw backyard gigs in East LA, and also to use those backyard gigs to fundraise so that they could rent out their own halls, right? Again, DIY. So, yeah, it was all about accessibility, right? It was about the financial means. There's a lot of very like socioeconomic kind of like levels at play.
Yeah.
But I mean, like, look at what a badass and like what a really incredible, right, legacy that these bands in the 80s were able to create because of their resiliency.
Exactly. You just like pulled that word out of my brain right now, because I was about to say that the resilience, on top of it, us being communities of color, right? That's already something against us. So we're already used to resilience working through that. And on top of that, the music accessibility is like, dude, we're communities of color, but we're creative and we need these forms of expression.
Exactly.
Do it yourself.
Exactly.
The most punk thing you can do.
It's part of our ethos. So, it makes sense, of course.
Now, how does that ethos for you, how has that played a role in your journalistic work at this point? Like just being a writer, I guess.
Let's see, the DIY ethos in my career. Well, I feel like I don't like taking no for an answer. Mm-hmm. It's always just been me. So I feel like whenever I have an idea about punk coverage or punk stories, I always kind of like find a way to make it happen, even if I don't necessarily have a publisher or an editor or somebody that like, wants to do it or believes in the story. And I kind of tend to like, I'll do my own reporting. I'll source my stories. I'll reach out to community members and, I'll create something. And by the time it's done or by the time I like showcase it, to an editor or a potential publisher, they're just like, wow. So I don't know. I feel like I tend to go rogue a lot in my career,
Nice.
Mostly as a freelancer, right? But also I think like the whole DIY aspect, I think, especially early in my career, I think that was like my motivator, especially with Big Wheel magazine and some of the other stuff that I've done over the years. I think once you grow up, I think in this mindset of DIY, it's very hard to, I think, grow out of it or shake it off, right?
Yeah.
And I think because of that, because I don't like taking no for an answer, I'm not the kind of person that thinks things are impossible. So, if someone thinks like, oh, this isn't doable, or it's impossible. I'm just like, no, like, my mom used to always say like, ponte trucha, aliviánate, like all of these things. And I feel like it really like instilled that like hustler mentality, which I think like if you're really into DIY, you're kind of a hustler by default, right? Because you make things happen, you create,
you're finding solutions
exactly,
to things,
exactly. So, I guess if I have to kind of like think out loud, and which I basically am doing, and wonder and think about the ways in which DIY has influenced my career, I think that's a really major way, is that mentality and that mindset. And I think that has helped me kind of progress a lot in my career, but also just, I don't know, make shit happen.
Yeah. You may not have the resources in your favor, but you're going to find a way to be like challenge accepted,
Exactly. And so I feel like if you don't have that DIY mentality, then of course, when you face obstacles or problems or challenges or pushback into what you're trying to do, maybe you're not going to think outside the box. Maybe you're not going to look for avenues, right, to get things done. But I don't know. I mean, I guess we're made different.
Yeah. Now, that's a fascinating question to me, because I've always trying to figure out like, how can we get people to be in that mindset? It's really hard sometimes, because unless you've been put into situations where you're consistently being put through different obstacles, it's hard for you to really like get an idea of how to navigate through your issues,
Yeah, exactly. And I think, I mean, if you even consider, right, like someone who's born, into like an affluent family, and they've been given everything their whole lives, and and then you contrast that with someone who maybe like grew up, below the poverty line, right? And they had to fight for everything, and they had to like really work hard to achieve, the status or the dream or whatever it is that they want. I mean, those two individuals will have very different outlooks on life, right?
Of course.
And so I think like when you grow up with this DIY mindset, and you grow up in like the kinds of environments that we grew up in, especially out here in the greater Los Angeles area, I mean, we're going to be built different. You know what I mean?
Now, for you, I mean, at this point, you've won a couple of awards just out of your career. You know, first and foremost, congratulations, because you just got another one.
Thank you.
A couple weeks ago.
Yeah, it was. So I won second place at the the National Association of Hispanic Journalists, aka NAJ. Every year they have an annual Enye Awards, and I won second place. First place went to my dear friend and colleague John Quiñones. And I feel so proud. Like, I'm not salty. I swear to God, I'm not salty. I'm not sad. Like, it's an honor to be second place to him because he's so iconic. But yes, so that I won, I think like a week and a half ago.
Yeah.
So yes. And then the week prior, I had won a couple of awards with the LA Press Club. And we had just talked about it, right? Yeah. So, it's been a very busy, like, award season for sure. The majority of these awards have been because of my Uvalde reporting and my Uvalde stories. So, with this Enye Award that I got at the NAJ conference, I think that actually concludes, the season in which my Uvalde stories are eligible, right? Because it's always like the year prior when it comes to submissions. So, yeah, the Enye Award concluded it, and I'm really glad. I'm really happy. Yeah. I feel like that sort of puts like a big chapter behind me. Not in an interpersonal way, because I'm still very connected with the families that I work with on the ground, but in terms of like those specific stories, that specific phase of my life, I kind of feel like it's now like a little bit in like, what's the phrase, like the rear view, like mirror. I can just like look back on it. Yeah. So
now, mentioning the whole, this do-it-yourself attitude that you've been carrying now, and you're seeing like the fruits of your labor getting all these awards. Like, how does that make you feel in terms of like self-reflective, like what have I done with myself?
It's really crazy because I get people who, friends, strangers, people who, keep up with what I'm doing, and they're just like, oh my gosh, congratulations. You're killing it. And, you must be so like, they think that maybe I've reached a point where it's like, oh, like another day, another trophy, right? And I actually don't feel like that, because do I believe I earned these awards? Of course, absolutely. I believe in my work. I believe in what I do. It's just that I think I still, in so many ways, still see myself as, just a purple-haired street punk from Santa Ana. I grew up below the poverty line. Yeah. My parents, were alcoholics. I grew up in a really dysfunctional, family. And so I had a very hard upbringing. I had a very difficult childhood. And I feel like in so many ways, it keeps me humble, right? Because I don't let any of this get to my head. In fact, I constantly feel like I should have never made it out of the hood, right?
Damn,
I should have never made it. Like, the odds in life were so against me, from, the parents that I had, the financial situation we were in. And I almost dropped out of high school. My senior year, I was failing every single class, because looking back, I realized now, like, I was so depressed, and I would ditch all of my classes literally all the time to go drinking with the punks and, to do stupid punk stuff. And so, like, I almost didn't graduate. In fact, my mom had encouraged me to drop out. She was like, si no te gusta la escuela, ponte a trabajar, mija, está bien. La escuela no es para todos. And it was right, like a very understanding tone. But at the same time, like, here's my mom encouraging me to drop out. And so I feel like I constantly think like, wow, I really shouldn't be here. I don't know, like, I should have never made it this far. And yet I am. And so every time I win an award, I swear, like, my head isn't big yet. I'm still not at that point where I'm like, oh, typical. Of course I was going to win it. No, like, in fact, I just constantly think like, wow, I can't believe it. I can't believe I'm here and I'm taking up this space. And not only am I taking up this space, but I'm getting awarded for it. I'm being recognized for it. I'm being honored for it. So every single time, like, I win something, I just mostly think like, wow, I'm so grateful. I'm just so grateful and so thankful. I really don't take any of it for granted. And again, like, my friends will joke like, oh, like another award for you. Like, oh, you got like 20 awards now. And, I think sometimes people think that maybe I'm like, and I do post about them, right? Because I'm proud.
Of course.
And so like I'll post pictures, I'll post, updates, and it might seem to people like maybe like I'm showing off or like I'm full of, like I'm tooting my own horn, I'm full of it. Actually, and it's not even that. I'm just like literally just demonstrating my gratitude.
Do you feel like that pressure, like, oh shit, like what's next? Am I going to reach the same point?
Actually, no, because,
okay, sick.
I first of all, my background in journalism, it's really diverse. I've never just done one thing, right? So some people, they'll pick up a beat that they love and they'll, mostly focus on food journalism or entertainment. And I think because I started my journalism career with a very big news network in the U.S., I had to do everything. I had to do breaking news. I had to do weather stories. I had to do politics. I had to do, entertainment and pop culture. But you know what I mean? Like, you're not expected in national news to only do one thing. You have to know how to do everything. So that was early in my career. And as I started kind of like freelancing more and, doing the kinds of stories that I personally like doing, which again are mostly rooted in entertainment or intersectional feminism, right? Or culture stories, specifically Latina stories. I hadn't done like hard news in a while. And again, this is mostly by choice. And so when Uvalde came up, I instantly knew I wanted to go. I wanted to go and help the people on the ground with the platforms that I had, right, with the skills that I had as a journalist to help, tell these stories and document what's happening. So once I was in it, that's where all of my attention went. I stopped freelancing for the most part. I stopped. And again, I mean, you've seen my work. So like all of the fun stuff that I love doing, the punk stories, the music stories, entertainment, I ceased all of that and gave 100% of my attention to Uvalde. And so with the conclusion of like my reporting in Uvalde, I felt more relieved than anything because it was very mentally tough and the stories were, so removed from the normal types of stories that I like to do that I felt relief in that, okay, I felt like I did my job. I did my mission that I had set out to achieve. And so now I can decompress and do the things that I like doing. Like I report on the beats that I like doing, right? So go back to entertainment, do more, music stuff, do more punk stuff. And I think once Uvalde ended, I kind of hit the ground running with that. Like the article that I did for Spin on the East LA backyard culture, like that was, I wrote that like literally a month after Uvalde. And it got published in the fall, right? Like, and there were a lot of other different stories that I did that were focused on music. I worked on a special for Hispanic Heritage Month at my network. And it was looking at like the Latina, like trailblazers and talent, that have helped bring kind of that Latina presence, across the U.S. Mainstream music industry. So I don't know, like I haven't felt at all like after Uvalde, like, oh my gosh, what am I going to do next? How am I going to top it? No, I just felt like I'm going to continue doing what I like doing, which is like culture stories, entertainment stories, so, and it also doesn't feel like, I don't feel any pressure or a sense of like, how am I going to do something as meaningful as Uvalde? Because I think if I was in that mindset to begin with, then I wouldn't have done Uvalde for the right reasons, like, of course. I wanted to go not because of the accolades or, the recognition or whatever. I wanted to go because I wanted to help that community because their community looks like mine, right? Yeah. They're mostly Mexican American, low income. So yeah, I know that was long-winded, but
no. I mean, it's part of the story, though. I mean, for you, how was that experience being on the ground? How long were you there for?
So we collectively we were there for about a year. I think the last time that I was in Uvalde was on the 1 year mark, which was May 24, 2023. And I have not been back since. But again, I'm still very close and very connected with the families, the survivors, the victims, who I reported on the ground. So actually, I was just texting with two of the families earlier today. And so it even though specifically this 1 year project was intended for, this 2-hour special, and, all of the other stories and articles and things that came along the way were just kind of part of like this like pod, if, for lack of a better description. It doesn't really feel like it was just a 1 year project. You know what I mean? Granted, again, I haven't been there since the 1 year mark. And so, it sort of seems like, well, that's really where the 1 year project ended. But yeah, it doesn't feel like that. I did some articles after the 1 year mark on Uvalde, and I don't know, just being a part of the family's lives and being a part of their journey still. I don't know, it doesn't feel, and again, I'm not doing work, like it's not like I'm actively like still documenting them or reporting on them, but I guess because we became so connected and so close, and I was there for these really sensitive and intense moments in their lives, I don't know, it doesn't feel like, well, it was only a year and it's over.
That's crazy. I mean, I can't comprehend how that feels, that whatever they're going through, right? Like, and on top of that, you're just coming in just to kind of see the outcome of what happened. Like, that's still a shitload of pressure that, like the toll that it takes mentally, like you said, you have to take a minute to decompress just so you can hit the ground running again. Exactly.
And like I said, like there's been so many like other projects and things that have come out of that year. So there's also the book, right, which is a 1 year in Uvalde. It's spearheaded by Maria Elena Salinas and John Quiñones, and our collective experiences are detailed in the book. So, and that came at the close to the 2 year mark, right? Then I had the articles that I did. Then, like it's just been like little things here and there. The team recently released a documentary called Printed Black, which is actually about the local newspaper's perspective and journey in documenting the aftermath of the mass shooting. So you know what I mean? Like all of these different projects that have come after the fact, it just doesn't feel like Uvalde has really ended for us.
Okay. I mean, yeah, I think I recently saw that you posted that Mia Cerillo's just having the quinceañera celebration, right?
Yes. So, I know. So, Mia and her family came out to California in March of this year. And so they stayed at my place. They stayed with me. Again, we're very connected, very tight. I really did form these very meaningful relationships with the people in Uvalde. So, when they were out here, Mia wanted to go to Moda 2000, which is like a really huge like quinceañera store that is based in Anaheim. And so while she was out here, she went to Moda 2000 and saw the dress of her dreams. Yeah. And they're actually coming back later this year to work on like the fittings, right? Like and all that stuff, which is like really amazing. And so like the planning is underway right now. Because I mean, being a Latino, quinceañeras take a long time to. It's a lot. It's months of preparation, months of planning. So her birthday is next year. She's turning 15. But again, like everything is already starting to get underway. So Mia doesn't come from a family of money. They're very working class, very very normal family, and they're like fundraising and doing different things to sort of like. You get some sponsors and get some financial help. They're looking for like, madrinas and padrinos, so to speak, that can help like pitch in. And to them, it's like a beautiful milestone, right? Because Mia survived.
Yeah, that's a crazy part.
She survived something that no child should ever have to go through. Yeah. And so they feel so lucky, right? That they even have this milestone that they can celebrate. Whereas, 19 other families, don't. And so, it is going to be really special. I will be down there, obviously, for Mia's quinceañera, and they're coming back to California later this year. So yeah, that's sort of the latest, I think, out of Uvalde in terms of like, better news other than like everything else that we've been witnessing for the last 2 years.
Now, these events, or for the most part, these reports that you do, how do they change you personally? Like, how does it affect you in terms of like, the introspective part? Like, how does it, I don't know, does it solidify what you're trying to accomplish with your work?
Yeah, I think so. I actually wrote like a firsthand like perspective essay article in which I talked about my relationship with Mia's family. And so the way that happened was that so our digital platform had asked if anyone had any, like, they call it reporter's notebook, which is like your first person like perspective that you write out, which we don't normally do in news, as you know. Mm-hmm. And they had said, like, if anybody has a really good story or like a really like interesting experience that they want to share, about your time in Uvalde, because again, this was a very big team that was deployed. And so I said, oh yeah, like I would love to. And I knew instantly that I wanted to write about Mia. Just because the circumstances and the way that relationship happened. I mean, her family didn't want to do any TV, any interviews, and they made that clear very early on that they just weren't comfortable. They weren't, and every time that I was in Uvalde at the beginning, I would check in on them, not from the news perspective, not as a journalist, not as like a, hey, are you ready to talk? It was like, how are you? Do you need anything? Like, and I was visiting with them months before they, gave the okay. And we were really honestly just forming a friendship.
Yeah.
And eventually I happened to be in Uvalde during Christmas. And they knew that, of course. And I was in Uvalde to document other families who were working, with me. And Mia's mom just texted me on Christmas and was like, hey, you're in town, right? And I was like, yeah. And she called me. She's like, come over. Like, we're having tamales. We're having menudo. Nice. All of my favorite, like Mexican foods. And I'm like, okay. Mm-hmm. And she's like, oh, and bring your camera. You can shoot if you want. And I'm like, oh, my God. So I feel like that relationship was just like, it was so organic. You know what I mean? It wasn't about pressuring them. It wasn't about trying to book them. It really, again, I wanted to go to Uvalde to help these families, and helping them wasn't just through my journalism. It was also, how can I help them as human beings? Yeah. Right. And thereafter, I was a part of like Mia's experiences, right? Like I was there with her when she won the Kid Hero Award for calling 911. There were all of these different moments that they allowed me, to witness with them. And I just felt like it was so profound and special that I wanted to talk about how this relationship even happened in the first place and how it evolved. And so when I wrote that piece, I really wasn't expecting anything. Again, I just thought, like, I think this is something that like I'd like to share with people and that I think people would appreciate, and especially to like learn so much about Mia's story. Mia was actually born with a disease, like an issue, which was life-threatening. So even as a baby, she almost didn't survive.
Yeah.
So it's like she survived as a baby, and then she survived this mass shooting. It's like, and in her family's eyes, and I have the quote in my piece, they say that like she's their miracle. So and this is something that like that hadn't been reported otherwise, and nobody would have known it because it was told to me like as a friend, what I mean? And and of course I had gone to Mia's parents, Miguel and Abigail, saying, hey, like I want to write about this. Is that okay? Can I like reference like some of the moments we experienced together, like as friends, as like casual? And they were like, yeah, of course, go for it. Again, this goes back on the trust that we built. And so that piece, when it got published, I got a lot of really great feedback from people at my company. Some people that I've never spoken to, and they were just like, this is a really moving story. Oh my gosh. And now when I read it back, I'm like, this, I don't know, it affirms my whole wanting to have been there in the first place. Like it really affirms like the work that I did, how I moved around these families with the utmost sensitivity and integrity, I guess, and respect overall for them. And yeah, I feel proud.
Yeah, no, I mean, it's a big change. I mean, just I read that article, you know, and just again, as a reader, yeah, you read it, you're looking at this and you're like, damn, like you did a really good job in putting the reader in the shoes of your experience, because, you know, a lot of the times, and it's unfortunate, you know, this event happened and then a couple of days, couple of weeks later, move on to the next thing, you know, and those people's struggles, the pains, the loss, like it stays there, you know, and for it to just kind of move on from the mainstream media, you know, it's fucked up, you know, it's straight up. So, you know, the fact that you took the time to really build upon, like, it's, you know, that's a raw experience that you provided to them as well. You just kind of help their healing as well.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Now, for you, I know you also had an experience when you went to Mexico. I think it was a couple of years ago, right?
Yes.
I want to know a little bit about that.
Yeah. So a couple of years ago, I started getting really curious about my heritage because I grew up not really knowing anything about it. So most of my grandparents have been, you know, deceased since I was a kid. And I just really was in the dark about so much. And is that my dog snoring? Sorry. I'm like, what is that sound? Oh, he is knocked out. So I'd asked my dad if I could go join him in Michoacan. And he said, sure, of course. And it was in Michoacan that I discovered for the first time that I had all of these relatives there, which I was like, wait, what? Like, how do I have all these like aunts and uncles, all these primos and primas that I had no idea existed, but they knew everything about me. They knew that I was my dad's eldest. They knew, you know, my mom, like everything. And I blame my dad for this, by the way, for never telling me about my poor family members who I like love now. And so when I was there, my tío Israel was sort of like taking us everywhere, giving us like, you know, tours of like Michoacan. He's like very proud to be from Michoacan. And he told me that we were Purépecha. And I was like, what the hell is that? Like, I had no idea what he was talking about. He's like, Purépecha? Like, you, in Spanish, of course, because he doesn't speak English. He was like, Purépecha? What do you mean you don't know what Purépecha is? Like, it's what you are. And I'm like, I have no idea what that is. And I like kept botching the name. I remember it being like Purépecha, you know, like it was awful. And he was like, I'm going to take you to Pátzcuaro. And so we went to Pátzcuaro and I was like so amazed because it was like, it was gorgeous. And, you know, there's all like the little islands on the lake. Like I was really blown away. And he took me to the Yacatas, which are the Purépecha pyramids in Sinsunsan. And man, talk about like, I don't know, like an out of body experience or like the experience of a lifetime. I mean, there's so many ways I can describe it, but like to not know my whole life that I was, you know, indigenous, and not just indigenous, but like specifically Purépecha, which are the indigenous people of Michoacan. I mean, I was just like, I feel like I almost had like an identity crisis.
Crazy.
Right? Because like, you know, I was born here. I was born in California. I was raised here my whole life. We never went to Mexico for the summers like a lot of families do. We never did any of that. So I grew up very kind of like Americanized, like totally like a coconut for sure. Yeah. And so going from that to realizing, oh, what? Like, I have a very rich heritage that I knew nothing about, that is even very historical when it comes to like the fall of the Aztecs. And you know, the Purépechas were very instrumental and key in that because they actually collaborated with the Spaniards because the Purépechas and the Aztecs were enemies. And I don't know, I guess to know that that's part of like my legacy, that those are my ancestors. I don't know. I thought it was like a really incredible experience. And, there was something I wanted to like add. So, okay, so I feel like being, first generation Mexican American, being born here, and because my parents were like so obsessed with assimilation and not wanting me to be, like paisa or anything like that. I feel like one, they kept me in the dark about so much of my, ancestry, but also like I assumed that I was like every other mestiza, like, oh, just a mix of like Spanish and, like indigenous Mexican, whatever, like, and you get so kind of like diluted, right? Like from whatever your ancestors were, that you're just kind of like a mutt, right?
Yeah, you know what? That's a good way to put it. Yeah.
So I don't know. I just always thought like, whatever, I'm a mutt. I'm a Mexican American mutt. Who knows like what my great grandparents were? Who knows if they were from Spain or from, like a little pueblo? Who knows? Who cares, right? And to know like, okay, yeah, I mean, we are a little bit like mestizos anyway. Yeah, right. That's a given because of colonialism and its history. But yeah, to know that like that I'm part of this very rich heritage from Michoacan, to know that my great grandmother is still alive and still speaks the language, and then to find out that my dad knows the language too. He knows how to speak Purépecha and never told me my whole life. I'm just like, what?
You were just
like,
in the dark about everything.
About everything, literally. Like, again, like I feel like I had an identity crisis after that, because I'm like, who am I? Like, who am I even? And then you also start kind of getting into the guilt of it, right? Like the Purépecha language is, it's not extinct, but it's not surviving well.
Yeah.
I don't have the number off the top of my head, but it's like thousands speak the language versus like English millions speak it, right? So the numbers are so dismal, and you kind of start questioning like your place in that. Like, well, I don't know how to speak Purépecha, and I don't know anything about the customs, and I don't, like, so how can I help like keep this alive? How do I preserve it? And like if I don't, like, am I guilty of eradicating like this legacy, this heritage, this culture? So that I feel like the cultural guilt. And again, like if I hadn't taken initiative to ask my dad to take me, I probably still wouldn't know. And like what would I have known? I don't know.
Everything you said, I completely relate to, because again, like the whole mutt thing, like, you grew up watching American TV, consuming American media, like you feel like that's your identity until you get older and you realize like, wait a second, no, like there's a whole other part of me that I have no idea about. That's, and it's understandable, because I think your parents come in and they're trying to assimilate. I've asked my parents before too, like, where are you guys, where's like my great grandparents from? And they're like, I don't know, like I've never asked. It's like, what? Like you were in Mexico, how do you guys not know? And now it's up to me to kind of do that soul searching and try to again find out where I'm from, and like it's overwhelming sometimes, And
a lot of that has to do with generational trauma.
Yeah.
So sometimes families will go through generations of not asking questions, not doing the work to preserve like their family history or their lineage, because there's some kind of trauma involved, right? Like there's, there's, again, I don't know, for lack of a better word, there's trauma in the family, right? There's a parent who was absent, or, parent who died, and things are touchy and sensitive, right? For families to address. So, they'll go their whole lives not asking questions and also not being told. And by the time they get curious, it's too late, because, people have passed away, and, they're the people that would have known. So I think a lot of that also is because of generational trauma. And then the other part is like having to do the work for yourself.
Yeah.
Right? Like doing your own investigating, asking questions, reaching out to family members who are still alive, and trying to get to the bottom of like being able to connect the threads. Right? So in a lot of, in very huge ways, it's not entirely our fault, right?
Yeah.
These are kind of things that like were already happening or not happening, right? Decades, before, and which unfortunately by the time it gets to our generation, there's already so much missing from the historical record.
Yeah, like you said, like at that point, like is it up to you to kind of let it just fade away, or like embrace it and already start trying to pick up the pieces and again put it back together? And that's a lot. That's a lot of weight, you know?
Exactly. I did try, like, after I came back from that specific trip in Michoacan, I was doing Zoom lessons through this, like, online school in Mexico City. They were offering Purépecha classes. I did it for a semester. It is a very, very difficult language, as I've learned most indigenous languages are, mostly because the alphabets tend to be a lot shorter or incomplete, and because a lot of like the Purépecha language specifically, it was never written down. So it's not like they had a list of like the alphabets and the vowels. It was something that, like, once the Spanish taught, you know, the Purépechas to read and write, that they kind of started to like accumulate and figure out, like, okay, how do we write out our language? So and a lot of that is like the Spanish interpretation of what the Purépecha language was. So it's not even still, it's not even through like the authentic like Purépecha perspective. It's as defined and written and, you know, historicized by the Spanish. So I know, it's so crazy. And so a lot of indigenous languages tend to be very difficult because they're missing a lot of like the words, the lexicon, right? And it is tough. So I applaud anyone who knows how to speak any of like these indigenous languages from Mexico, because it is tough work.
Yeah, I mean, on top of that, you know, applaud to yourself as well for the fact that you were curious enough to ask the questions, you know, because I think, you know, I'm in my, you know, early 30s too, you can say, you know. But for me to figure this out on you know, late 20s, early 30s, it's like, dude, I wasted 2 decades and a half of not knowing this, you know, and I feel like I'm playing catch up. But the good thing about it is now that I feel like I'm, you know, a better developed adult, I have the conscious ability to be like, yo, I'm going to take it upon myself to do this, you know, and know that there's pressure, that there's weight, that there's things working against me, but I'm still willing to put the work in to try to figure out where we're coming from, you know, and, you know, and then teach the new generation, you know, the kids coming up.
That's exactly how I feel too.
Yeah. Well, we're at that time here, Steph. For people to get in contact with you, to follow your work, to get more information about what you do, like, where can people find you?
Check out my website, stephmendez.com. It's got my articles, it's got video pieces that I've done, it's got all kinds of stuff about me, and you can reach out to me there as well if you ever want to chat or, you know, hit me up and get a punk album recommendation.
Yeah. You know what, by the way, your website is badass. Like, all fucking punked out. Dope.
Thank you.
Thank you again for making the time, Steph, and we'll see you next time.
Thanks so much.
Peace out, everybody.